300,000 years. That's how long humans have been around. And for most of that time, according to your high school textbook, we lived in tiny primitive bands where absolutely nothing interesting ever happened. Then 10,000 years ago, someone figured out farming, and suddenly civilization began. Tonight, we'll discover that the archaeological record tells a completely different story. In just the last few decades, we've unearthed ice age monuments that required massive coordinated labor, built by people who had no agriculture whatsoever, and we've excavated entire cities where thousands of people thrived for centuries without permanent rulers. This isn't just about correcting some dates in a textbook. The story of history you learned in school is the foundation for every assumption about why modern life has to be the way it is. Why inequality feels inevitable. Why you assume that complex societies rare someone to be in charge. What if human history shows the exact? What if the evidence shows our ancestors lived differently for most of human existence? The evidence is compelling. We now know they built large-scale societies without creating permanent leadership. And when inequality started emerging, they recognized it and consciously restructured their communities to reverse it. These were people just as smart as us, animated by curiosity, making deliberate, playful, and hopeful choice about how to live together. Their actions prove that we are not in a tilherd for hierarchy and that a different social order is possible. Tonight, we explore what they actually bought, how they organized themselves, and why we've been told to forget it was ever possible. By recovering this story, we discover a path toward imagining new forms of freedom and new ways of organizing society. Before we begin, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps us discover these explorations of history, and let us know in the comments which topics you'd like us to explore. Next, now settle in as we commence our exploration of how we truly came to be. This is the real story of how human societies began. Chapter 1. The Lure of the Wild. It's 1753. Benjamin Franklin sits at his desk in Philadelphia, puzzling over reports that keep crossing his path. European settlers captured by Native Americans refusing to come home, even when their birth families begged them to return. Children who'd been taken young, brought back to colonial society, and treated with every kindness, would slip away in the night, back to the woods, and back to what Franklin and his contemporaries called savagery. He wrote about one particular case that stuck with him. A man stood to inherit a good estate, property, wealth, everything colonial society said you shall want. But the care required tonnage, the constant attention to accounts, and servants and social obligations, it exhausted him. So he handed the whole thing to his younger brother. Taking only his gun and a coat, he disappeared into the forest and never looked back. This wasn't rare. From the carolers to Quebec, the pattern repeated. Hector St. John Deere would later describe seeing a soft reunited children clinging to their adoptive indigenous parents, terrified of being dragged back to civilization. The colonists called it captivity. But for those who lived it, something else was happening. They'd experienced both worlds, weighed them against each other, and they chose. The pattern started causing genuine panic in colonial administration. European civilization was supposed to represent the height of human achievement, the direction all societies naturally moved. But their own people, once they'd tasted indigenous life, were voting with their feet in the wrong direction. The question haunted them. If civilization was so obviously superior, why did people who knew both worlds keep choosing the other one? This was the moment when something shifted in how Europeans would tell the story of human history. They needed an answer to these defections, a way to explain why their own people were rejecting everything that supposedly made Europe advanced so. They began inventing a new story, one where indigenous peoples weren't truly choosing their way of life. They were simply stuck in an earlier stage of human development, like children who hadn't grown up yet. In this new story, history only moved one way, from primitive to civilized, and anyone living differently was just a relic of the past, not someone who'd deliberately chosen a different path. These ideas would eventually harden into what we still learn today, that human societies naturally evolve from simpler to complex, that our ancestors lived in ignorance, waiting for civilization to arrive. But it all started here as a way to avoid facing what those defectors were, demonstrating the defectors themselves had plenty to say about their choice. They spoke of their disgust with European competence, the constant scramble for status, the way every interaction became a calculation. Colonial life meant endless toil for things that brought no happiness. Indigenous life offered something else, intense social bonds, the certainty that no one would fall into poverty while others had plenty. A different kind of security, rooted in knowing others genuinely cared for your well-being. Helena Valero's story brings this choice into sharp focus. A Brazilian woman of Spanish descent, abducted by the Yanomami in 1932 when she was just a girl. She lived among them for 2 decades. She was married twice and had children. She gained respect and position within the community. Then, in 1956, she decided to find her birth family, Totri civilization, again. The Brazil she returned to offered occasional hunger and constant loneliness pressed in from our sides. She'd lived in both worlds, no experienced them as an adult capable of judgment, and she made her choice. She went back to the Yanomami. When anthropologists later interviewed her, she pushed against their The Yanomami weren't devils, she said, but they weren't tangles either. They were human like the rest of us. That phrase carries weight, human like us, rest of us. Because what this discourse revealed wasn't that indigenous life was perfect or that European life was purely miserable. Rather, they suggested that many of the things Europeans took as natural, inevitable features of human society simply weren't. Poverty wasn't inevitable, neither was the isolation that came from individualism, neither was the dulling routine of what would later be called wage labor. These weren't uninformed choices made by people who didn't understand what they were giving up. They knew exactly what they were walking away from, and still they chose societies that Europeans dismissed as primitive and savage. The question that haunted colonial authorities, the question Franklin called quite answer, was simple and unsettling. What if the savages had something figured out that civilization had lost? Chapter 2. Listening to the Savage Critic. The ships arrived in the early 1600s, carrying more than supplies and they brought Jesuit missionaries, men in black robes, who'd crossed an ocean to save souls. Priests came to the forests and river valleys of New France, expecting to find simple people waiting for enlightenment. Instead, they found themselves locked in philosophical debates that would shake the foundations of everything they believed about civilization itself. The missionaries wrote everything down. Every conversation, every argument, every uncomfortable question posed by the people they'd come to convert. Their letters and reports would eventually fill 71 volumes. What they preserved without quite meaning to was something trendy, a systematic indigenous critique of European society recorded in by the very people being criticized. Father Pierre Barr reached Nova Scotia in 6008. He spent his days among the Mi'kmaq people, learning their language, observing their customs, preparing to bring them the word of God. But the Mi'kmaq were observing him right back, and what they saw troubled them deeply. You are always fighting and quarreling among yourselves, they told him. We live peaceably. You are envious and are all the time slandering each other. You are thieves and deceivers. You are covetous and are neither generous nor kind. As for us, if we have a morsel of bread, we share it with our neighbor. When Bayard tried to explain French superiority, pointing to their ships and tools and weapons, the Mi'kmaq laughed. Those weren't signs of wealth. Real wealth was a nothing else entirely. It was ease, comfort, time to think, to talk, tosomly exist. The French had traded all of this away for objects that brought no happiness. They worked constantly, worried about tomorrow, fought over possessions that couldn't follow them beyond death. 20 years later, Brother Gabriel Sargard lived among the Wendat people. He watched them watching the French argue. It was painful to observe. The colonists interrupt constantly. They raised their voices, made weak arguments, refused to listen. In Wendat councils, things worked differently. A speaker might hold forth for hours, developing complete arguments, while others sat in complete silence. Only when Sumian finished entirely would another begin, often starting by summarizing what had been said. This showed they'd truly listened. The Wendat found French conversation as chaotic as French society itself. These weren't isolated observations. Across 71 volumes of Jesuit records, these themes appeared again and again. The indigenous peoples weren't impressed by European civilization. They saw it as a kind of voluntary slavery. Men jumping when superiors spoke, following laws they had no part in making, living in constant fear of punishment. Father Lejeune worked among the Montagnais Naskapi in 1642. He recorded their views on liberty with obvious frustration. They imagined that they ought, by right of birth, to enjoy the liberty of wild-ass cults, rendering no homage to anyone whomsoever, except when they like. They have reproached me 100 times, because we fear our captains. While they laugh, oughtn't make sport of theirs. The Montagnais chiefs led through persuasion and example, nothing more. Anyone who disagreed simply walked away. No one could force another person to do anything against their will. This wasn't ours. It was a different kind of order, one the Jesuits struggled to understand. Father Lamant documented Wendat political life in 1644. His observations were precise. I do not believe there is any people on earth freer than Thean, less able to allow the subjection of their wills to any power. Fathers here have no control over their children, or captains over their subjects, or the laws of the country over any of them, except in so far as each is pleased to submit to them. Even murder was handled without coercion. The offender's entire lineage would provide compensation to the victim's family. No prisons existed, no executions, yet Lamont admits something remarkable. This system maintained order more effectually than the personal punishment of criminals in France. The missionaries found this freedom deeply troubling. It ran counter to everything they believed. Faith requires ambition of will, mind, judgment. They called it the wicked liberty of the savages. Women's autonomy particularly scandaled them. American women controlled their own bodies. Unmarried women had sexual freedom. Married women could divorce at will. The Jesuits discovered they couldn't even translate their most basic concepts. The word Lord had no equivalent in these languages. Neither did commandment. These words simply didn't exist because the relationship she described didn't exist. Instead, these languages had rich vocabularies for consensus, for persuasion, for deliberation, nothing for arbitrary authority, nothing for unquestioning obedience. People who couldn't be commanded had to be convinced. This created entire societies of careful speakers and patient listeners. The Jesuits found themselves losing arguments to people they'd come to enlighten, and soon any particular wended statesman would carry these arguments beyond forest councils and missionary outposts. He would talk of them into the salons of Montreal and Quebec, where his words would echo through colonial society and prove impossible to ignore. Chapter 3, Candiar's Challenge. In the late 1600s, a particular voice arose above the rest in the conversations, Benway, two worlds. The French called him LRA, the muskrat. Though his given name was Candiaran, he was a statesman of the Wendat Confederacy, moving through the complex world of colonial politics with remarkable grace. Even those who opposite him acknowledged his brilliance. They spoke of his courage in battle, his skill in negotiation, his ability to hold entire rooms captivated when he spoke. The French governor's residence in Montreal became a stage for something extraordinary. Governor Frontenac would invite Candiar to his table where French officers gathered for evening. The wended statesman would take his seat among them, ready to discuss philosophy, religion, politics. Father Charlevoix, who witnessed these gatherings, later wrote of Candiar's unmatched intellect. Here was someone who could meet European thinkers on their own terms and consistently leave them searching for. Among those officers sat a young Frenchman named Louis Amadeng d'Asperan de la Wanton. He'd arrived in Canada in 1683, eager to learn indigenous slangs, skeptical of Jesuit teachings. Candandaran and Launton found common ground in their questioning of religious orthodoxy. They spent long evenings in conversation, the wended leader patiently explaining his world while methodically dispelling lanced assumptions about European superiority. Years passed, Leon found himself in exile, his radical views making Hyman welcome in France. From his refuge, he published books that would send ripples through European society. The most explosive contained dialogues between himself and a character called Adario, clearly based on Candia. For centuries, Western scholastics missed these as fiction. Leonton putting dangerous ideas into the mouth of an imaginary, noble savage, but Thurgmans match perfectly with documented Wendot perspectives. Everyone who knew Candiaran recognized these as exactly the kinds of debates Hugh was famous for. Through Launton's pen, Candiaran's voice traveled across oceans. The books appeared in English, German, Dutch, Italian. Publishers reprinted them for over a century, and what Candandi had to say struck at the heart of everything Europeans believed about themselves. He began with Christianity itself. If there was only one true religion, he asked, why hadn't God revealed it to all peoples equally? The whole premise seemed absurd to him. If God had really come to earth, surely he would have visited every nation, performing theism miracles, giving everyone the same laws. Instead, there were hundreds of religions, each claiming to be true, while the others were false. How convenient that the French religion just happened to be the only correct one. Christian doctrines crumbled under his scrutiny. Why would an all-powerful deity debase himself for flawed humans? How could Christians claim to follow one truth while killing each other over theological disputes? Original sin, redemption, eternal damnation. Candiaran examined each concept and found them wanting. But religion was merely his starting point. His deeper critique concerned the very structure of European society. Europeans needed elaborate systems, prisons, torture chambers, scaffolds. What kind of creatures, he wondered, had to be for said to do good through fear of punishment? The Winded had no judges, no jails, nor written laws. Yet they lived in greater harmony than the French, with all their courts and constables. The difference wasn't that Europeans were inherently wicked. The problem, Candy argued, was money. He called Ith, devil of devils, the tyrant of the French, the source of all evils. Money was the father of luxury and lies, of betrayal and insincerity. Because of money, fathers sold their children, husbands. Their wives, brothers killed brothers, friends proved false. This wasn't abstract theorizing. Candiaron connected it directly. Toendad practice. Why did his peer Planeva bring lawsuits? Because they refused to use money. And why refuse money? Because money required laws, and laws created masters and slaves. The connection was clear and damning when Longden protested that European society couldn't function with hierarchy and wealth. Candiaran had a simple response. Abandon the concepts of men and thine. Let equality take its place. He explained that wisdom, reason, and equity should define humanity, but material interests destroyed all three. A man motivated by interest could never be a man of reason. Could Lahuntanimogen, Candon, adopting Parisian life, the bowing and scraping, the hoarding of wealth while neighbors starved. Better for Leah Hunton to adopt Wendat Waysand, discover what freedom actually meant. These weren't polite suggestions. They were fundamental challenges. Toverithing European society claimed. Torah present. The impact resonated for generations. Candiaran's arguments inspired Montesquieu's Persian letters, Voltaire's writings, Darrow's reflections on Tahiti. A whole literary tradition merged using outsider perspectives to critique European society. The Wendat statesman's linking of property, ton freedom of money to moral corruption, walled echo through Rousseau's work. Through socialist thought, through critique West, continue today. These systematic challenges from across Atlantic demanded response. European thinkers would need new stories about progress and civilization, new ways of understanding their own history that could somehow contain these uncomfortable truths. The conversation Candandy started would reshape how Europe understood itself and its place in the world. Chapter 4. Building the Evolutionary Cage. It's 1747 in Paris. A novelist named Madame de Graffini sits at her writing desk, preparing a second edition of her wildly successful book. She'd created an imaginary Inca princess named Zelia, who observed French society with fresh eyes, finding it lacking in all the ways that the inequality, the treatment of women, the absence of real freedom. The book had struck a nerve across Europe. De Graffine had asked various intellectuals for suggestions on her new edition. One response came from a brilliant young economist, Anne Robert Jack Turgot. His letter was long and revealing. He didn't deny the appeal of freedom and equality. We all love the idea, he admitted. But then came his twist. These beautiful things, Turid argued, were only possible in simple Situa. Everyone was equally poor. The Uendad could afford to be free because the Thi had so little. Their self-sufficient households meant they didn't need complex ecology. They were, in his view, stuck at the bottom of human development. Picture Tourette at his own desk, crafting this argument with careful precision. "A society's advance," he explained. "Technology amplifies natural difference and talent. Some people make better farmers, others excel as craftsmen. This leads to specialization and trade, to increasing complexity. The result is an inevitable progression from simple societies, like the Windat, to complex commercial civilizations like France. The poverty and inequality that defines character," had criticized, regrettable perhaps, but absolutely necessary for prosperity. Any attempt to maintain equality in an advanced society, Turgot warned, would require crushing state intervention. "Look at Thinecourt," he said. "They'd tried to enforce uniformity and created despotism instead." He urged de Graffine to rewrite her novel, so Zelia would come to understand the hard truths. She ignored Heiss's advice completely, but Turgot wasn't finished. Soon after, developed these ideas into something grander. Human societies, he proposed, naturally progressed through 4 distinct stages. First came hunting, then pastoralism, then farming, and finally urban commercial civilization. Each stage was defined by how people got their food. It was as inevitable as winter turning to spring. The theory spread through European intellectual circles with remarkable speed. Adam Smith picked it up in Glasgow. Lord Seas embraced it. Adam Ferguson and John Miller added their own within a single generation. This 4-stage model had become the standard way educated Europeans understood human history. What made this theory so devastatingly effective was how neatly it solved the problem posed by indigenous critics. Those troublesome questions about freedom and equality that Candiarin and others had raised. They belonged to an earlier stage of development. The when did Rand wrong exactly? They were just stuck in the past. Living fossils of hut Europeans had once been thousands of years ago. Suddenly, the way societies obtained food became the master key for sorting all of humanity onto a single ladder. Everything else that indigenous critics showed focused on freedom, equality, happiness became secondary concerns. What mattered was your stage of economic development. Egalitarian societies were a primitive, by definition. Occupying Thebatom rung, think about the audacity of this intellectual maneuver. Rather Thanins were, the indigenous critique, European thinkers simply declared it obsolete. History became a one-way street. It led from savagery to civilization, from equality to hierarchy, from freedom to complexity. The very things Candy had criticized, money, property, inequality, were transformed from problems into signs of progress. Indigenous peoples weren't critics anymore. They were just people who hadn't caught up yet. Their societies might be interesting for understanding distant ancestors, but they had nothing relevant to say about how advanced societies should organize themselves. This evolutionary framework would shape how the West understood human history for centuries to come. It provided what seemed like scientific justification for ignoring alternative ways of organizing society. It reasserted European superiority just when the Enlightenment had begun to question it. Born as a defense mechanism against uncomfortable truths, it became the foundation for how I still often think about the human past. But what if Torah and his followers had gotten it wrong? What if those supposedly simple hunter-gatherer bands they imagined at the bottom of Thelador had never existed in the way they thought? What if the deep human past contained far more social experimentation than neat stages allowed? The archaeological evidence, when we actually look at it, tells a very different story. Chapter 5. The Princes of Ice. It's a cold morning in northern Russia 30,000 years ago. The ground is frozen hard as iron. A small group of people have been working since dawn, chipping away at the earth with tools made from mammoth bone and stone. They're digging a grave, though grave seems too simple a word for what they're creating. This is a anything else entirely, something that will survive 30 millennia and confuse everyone who finds it. The body's there preparing to bury. Erectuo adolescents laid carefully head to head, around their necks, along their arms, across their clothing. Someone has sewn thousands upon thousands of ivory beads. Each bead took at least an hour to make, carved from mammoth tusk, drilled with atony hole, polished smooth. Thematics are staggering. 10,000 beads means 10,000 hours of human labor. That's 5 years of work if someone carved for 8 hours every single day. 5 years of Sapiens' life transformed in tournaments for these two young people at Sunia. Alongside the beads, they placed lance from straightened mammoth tusks, fox teeth arranged in decorative adorns, precious objects that speak of care and craftsmanship. This wasn't some hasty burial. This was an event that mobilized an entire community, perhaps for months. According to the theories we inherit from thinkers like Turgot, this didn't exist. Hunter-gatherers of the Ice Age were supposed to live in simply egalitarian ban. Everyone equal, everyone struggling to survive. No time for elaborate rituals, no resources for luxury. Yet here we have evidence of something that looks almost royal in its grandeur. Travel west from Russia, across the frozen expanse of ice-aged Europe, and you'll find more puzzles. Near the Italian coast in caves overlooking what would one day be the Mediterranean. Archaeologists discovered Anatha's spectacular burial from 28,000 years ago. They called him Il Principe. He clutched what appeared to be scepter made of flint. His head bore an elaborate crown of perforated shell sand deer teeth, materials that had traveled hundreds of miles to reach this cave. Antler batons, beautifully decorated, lay beside him. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. The materials came from distant places. Everything about the burial screamed importance, yet, when scientists examined Il Principe's skeleton more carefully, they discovered he was unusually tall for his time. Not just tall, but genuine exceptional, a giant by Ice Age standards. And he wasn't alone in his. Those two adolescents at Suningia showed pronounced congenital deformities in their bones. At Don Vestanich in Moravia, a triple burial revealed individuals with clear skeletal abnormalities. Grave after grave, the pattern repeated, the people buried. With the most laborious goods, the ones who receive it thousands of hours of community labor, were physically distinct from everyone else. Now we have to pause and think about what this actually means. If these were burials of hereditary elites, of royal bloodlines passing power from parent to child, we'd be looking at aristocracies comes almost entirely of people with dwarfism, gigantism, or other striking physical differences. That seems deeply unlikely, doesn't it? No society we know of has ever organized its quite like that. The bones, of course, can only tell you so much. Some of these individuals might have had differences we can't see in skill or remains. Perhaps they had albinism, making them stand out dramatically in their communities. Maybe they experienced seizures that people interpreted as divine visions. Some might have had unusual cognitive abilities or ways of perceiving the world that made them valuable and frightening in equal measure. What becomes clear is that Ice Age had sophisticated ways of thinking about human difference. They recognize certain individuals as requiring special treatment, but not because of wealth or hereditary rank. The investment of labor was enormous, yes, but it served a different purpose than creating permanent hierarchies. These weren't kings and queens in any sense we'd recognize. There was something else entirely. Consider how most bodies were created during this period. Archaeologists find scattered bones, skulls separated from skeletons, remains that were defleed and disarticulated. Sometimes bones were turned into tools or ornaments. The dead became part of the material world of the living in very literal ways. Against this background, the careful burial of an intact, decorated body stands out as profoundly unusual. It was reserved for specific individuals under specific circumstances. Many of these special burials show signs of what archaeologists delicately call containment: heavy stones placed on top of bodies, bindings that held limbs in place, as if the community simultaneously celebrated, constrained these individuals, honoring them while making very sure they stayed in the ground. Were they shamans, visionaries? People believed to travel between worlds. Their difference made them precious and dangerous, requiring treatment that acknowledged both aspects of their nature. These Ice Age societies confound every expectation we bring to them. They could mobilize incredible resources without creating permanent rulers. They experimented with social possibility that don't fit into our categories, finding ways to acknowledge human difference without turning it into systematic inequality. And, perhaps most surprisingly, they didn't even maintain the same social arrangements year-round. Chapter 6: Societies in Motion. A small band of hunters moves across the frozen steppes of Eastern Europe about 25,000 years ago. Just a dozen families, perhaps following reindeer tracks through the snow. They've been walking for days. The children are tired. They see smoke rising in the distant scene. Soon they hear voices, laughter, the sound of bone flutes carried on the wind. It's the gathering time, and where the pans next reveals something extrandy about how our ancestors sundered political power. These Ice Age hunters transform themselves with the seasons. The same people who spent spring as a sharing everything equally would create hierarchical societies come summer. Accepting the absolute authority of ritual leaders or hunt commanders, then autumn would arrive and they'd dismantle those hierarchies completely. They were experimenting with being human, trying on different political arrangements like seasonal clothing, keeping what worked for the moment, abandoning it when the season turned. We know about these transformations base of what they left behind at Sunhere in Russia. Those burials covered in thousands of ivory beads at Dolovestenich in the Czech Republic. The mysterious triple burial. Archaeological evidence shows these were seasonal meeting places where scattered bands came together and deliberated temporary hierarchies for specific purposes. At Udovo, mammoth bone structures contained enough meat to feed hundreds. Such massive hunts required commanders, required people willing to take orders. And then, when the season ended, those commanders rooted to being ordinary hunters. The hierarchies melted away like spring ice. Think about what this means. Our ancestors were making conscious political choices season after season. They knew what authority felt like Becker's. They created it every summer. They knew what equality felt like Becker's Bane. They lived it every winter. They could compare different ways of organizing society, evaluate them, decide which worked for which purpose. They were running political experiments in a seasonal schedule, and they'd been doing it for thousands of years. This pattern of Deliberation long after the Ice Age. The of Stonehenge around 5,000 years ago were still switching between radically different ways of being. During most of the year they lived as farmers in scattered homesteads across Britain. Come midwinter, they abandoned their fields and converged on Salisbury Plain, temporarily reverting to gathering hazlets while they hauled massive stones and held their ceremonies. Fort Ho's ritual months, they chose to become different, people living a different way. The anthropologist Marcel Mauskavithus, phenomenon, a name, double morphology. He studied the Inuit of the Arctic, documenting their remarkable transformations. In summer, small patriarchal bands of 20 or 30 people moved across the tundra. Male elders made decisions. Property was carefully marked. Each family owned their tools, their songs, their hunting grounds. Winter brought a complot transformanion. The bands gathered in communal house where hundreds met. Property dissolved in. The male authorities just voices in the crowd. Under ritual presidency of the goddess Sedna, they held spouse exchange. They literally became a different society for those dark months. The Great Plains. Nations took this political experimentation even further. The Cheyenne and Lakota had deliberate farming to become buffalo, choosing mobility over settled life. Most of the year they lived in small bands where every decision required consensus. Anyone who grew tuberosity would wake up alone, their followers having drifted to other camps in the night. This was radical egalitarianism, and they'd chosen it. Yet during the late summer buffalo hunt, these same people would create something, a temporary police state. They would select a warrior society and grant them absolute power. Anthropologist Robert Lowy documented these police could whip people, destroy property, even execute someone who endangered the hunt. For those few weeks, free people voluntarily submitted authority. They built their own machinery of coercion. Then came the truly remarkable part. When the hunt ended and the meat was distributed, the police would formally, they'd hand back their whips and special regalia. The mini-state they'd created would dissolve completely. Everyone would return to their egalitarian ways, scattering across Theplands until next year when they'd build apparatus of authority all over again. They could create states and dismantle them as easily as putting up and taking down their tippies. What does this tell us? For most often in history, our ancestors were sophisticated political actors, consciously experimenting with every form of social organization from absolute despotism to pure equality. They switched between these arrangements with the changing seasons, understanding for different situations called for different structures. They knew how to create authority when they needed it, for mammoth hunts or monument building. They knew how to dissolve it when the work was done. The real mystery is how we forgot this ability. How did temporary kings become permanent ones? How did seasonal police become How did we lose their political flexibility that once let us remake our social worlds with every turning season? Chapter 7. How we got stuck. If humans once moved so fluidly between different social arrangements, transforming themselves with their seasons, what happened? How did some societies lose this remarkably? It's tempting to look for a single moment when everything changed. Perhaps the first farmer planted seeds, or when someone first built a fence. But evidence suggests something far more gradual and strange. The trap wasn't sprung all at once. It was assembled piece by piece, often in places no one was watching. Consider what happened after the last ice age ended around 12,000 years ago. The world was warming, opening new possibilities for how people could live. But something else was happening. Two groups of people were beginning to define themselves more sharply against their neighbors. The anthropologist Marcel Mauss noticed this curious pattern. Cultures often establish who they are by refusing to do what others do. The Ebuskans of the Pacific Northwest knew exactly how to build the Sleekiaks their Inuit neighbors used. They had the materials, the skills, everything needed. They simply chose not. Being a buskin meant, among other things, not paddling around in kayaks. This deliberate rejection of neighboring created cultural boundaries that grew stronger over time. Anthropologists call this process schism, genesis. It's a word that sounds complicated, but describes something simple. When groups live near each other, they often developing opposite directions, like siblings determined to be nothing alike. One group becomes famous for their elaborate ceremonies, so their neighbors embrace a radical simplicity. One develops strict hierarchies. Their neighbors insist on absolute equality. This creative differentiation forms incredible cultural diversity, but it came with a hidden cost. As these boundaries hardened, it became more difficult to simply walk away when you didn't like how your society was. You couldn't just join the people over the hill anymore. They had become different, foreign, perhaps even. The very process that created distinct cultural identities made populations easier to contain. This first way societies began to lose flexibility. They lost the ability to leave, but cultural boundaries alone don't explain how inequality became permanent. For that, we need to look somewhere unexpected, not at fields and fences, but at the sacred realm where the first seeds of private property were quiet ligaminating, where another kind of flexibility was being lost. Even in societies famous for their egalitarianism, tools were shared freely and no one claimed exclusive ownership of territory. There was one domain where property existed. The anthropologist James Woodburn documented this among foragers like the Hadza of Tanzania. In everyday life, they shared almost everything but sacred knowledge. Ritual objects, ceremonial privileges, these were owned, guarded, kept secret. The pattern appears everywhere. Forest peoples of Central Africa had sacred trumpets, hidden from women and children. Discovery of these objects by the uninitiated could lead to severe punishment. Similar practices existed from New Guinea to the Amazon. Sacred flutes that only initiated men could. Masks that embodied dangaroos. Songs and dances that belonged to specific individuals or clans. Think about what this means for our question of flexibility. Those seasonal societies we discussed could have ritual herchies in summer precisely because Ivarayan knew they would end. The masks would come off. The ceremonies would conclude. Authority would dissolve with first snow. But here, in these sacred property rights, was something different. These exclusions didn't dissolve. They persisted year-round. The logic of the sacred mirrors, the logic of private property, both work through exclusion. The sociologist Durkheim described sacred things as being set apart. Polynesians used the taboo, meaning not to be touched. Modern property law, inherited from ancient Rome, defines ownership as right-shelled against the whole world. The absolute right to exclude others. Roman law even recognized the owner's right to destroy what they owned, what they called abuses. This power to destroy is what distinguishes true ownership from mere use. You might use something every day, But if you can destroy it, you don't truly own it in the Roman sense. Indigenous concepts often work differently, yet contain their own contradictions. Robert Lowy documented how Plains Indians owned songs, stories, medical knowledge, specific designs. These immaterial things were individual property, jealously guarded. A person might own a particular melody or healing formula while sharing their food and shelter freely. The same people who knew how to cycle between hierarchy and equality somehow accepted that certain things could never be shared. The anthropologist Strello observed something crucial among the Randa of Central Australia. During male initiation ceremonies, boys learn about Karinga, inscribed objects, fatware, relics of ancestral beings. These objects embodied title to clan lands. The transmission of this knowledge came through deliberate orals. Physical pain was used to create obedient citizens who would follow their elders without question. Here was the second piece of lost flexibility outside these rituals. Aranda children enjoyed remarkable freedom. They knew both states, freedom and submission. But increasingly, the principles from Thesaccord realm began bleeding into a Viridi life. The temporary common structures of ritual started forgetting to dissolve. The exclusive ownership of sacred objects expanded to include the ordinary things. Societies were learning how to create hierarchies, but forgetting the equally important skill of how to dismantle them. The ritual sphere had become a laboratory where inequality could grow beyond its traditional bounds. What made a seasonal flexibility possible was Severians' shared understanding that the hierarchies were temporary, like theatre. But when sacred property, rights and ritual authority began structuring daily life, when the performance never ended, that's when societies got stuck. Not through revolution or disaster, but through a slow forgetting of how to stop bung what they had only meant to temporarily become. Chapter 8. The Foragers Who Chose Their Fate. Welcome to the Pacific coast of North America, 1,500 years before any European ship appeared on the horizon. From Alaska down through California, the coastline teems with life. Rivers turn silver each year as salmon surge upstream. Forests of cedar and oak stretch inland for miles. And along this abundant shore, human societies flourish in numbers that would astonish Latavis. Tens of thousands of people living in permanent villages. They are populations as dense as many agricultural regions. Yet these people never farmed. They knew a Butagrish culture, had known for centuries from their southern neighbors. They simply chose not to adopt it. What they chose instead would Varian. We think we know about how human societies develop, because along this same coastline, with access to Thessam rivers, the same forests, the same salmon runs, two completely different worlds emerged. And the difference between them came down to values. Tohat kind of society people wanted to live in Travo first, to the northern reaches Tohat we now call the northwest coast. Here in the lands of the Tlingit, Haida-Kwakwaka, massive cedar houses rise from the shore. Some stretch 200 feet long, their posts carved into towering figures that tell family histories going back generations. Inside, behind painted screens, nobles preside over carefully ranked houses. When winter comes and the work of salmon harvest ends, these aristocrats host elaborate ceremonious skilled potlatches. Chiefs give away thousands of blankets, break copper shields worth fortunes, sometimes even sacrifice slaves, all to demonstrate their superiority over rivals. The slaves are what visitors would natus first. They're everywhere, perhaps a quarter of the Antiro population. War captives, mostly, or their descendants, born into bondage. They process the endless salmon harvest, smoking and drying fish, through exhausting days that free their masters for politics and ceremony. They can be traded like goods, killed at their owner's whim. Archaeological sites from 1800 BC show this system already in place. Fortified villages, elaborate aerials for some, sacrificial victims for others, now travel south into California, into flans of the Euro, Carac, and Hooper. The rivers here run just as thick, with the forests produce abundant. The population density matches anything to the north. But Stepinto, one of these villages, and Juventad, a completely different world. No slaves, no hereditary nobles, no massive houses displaying family crests. Instead, modest dwellings where people will value hard work above all else pursue. What one anthropologist would later call a Protestant ethic. 1,500 years before Protestantism existed. The contrast goes deeper than social structure. It shapes the small details of daily life. Among the Northwest Coast peoples, gathering firewood is beneath the dignity of free people. That's work for slaves. Among Californians, high-status men turn wood gathering into sacred practice, competing to carry the heaviest logs. Where northern nobles grow corpulent to display their leisure, southerners practice disciplined self-denial, where aristocrats up north stage elaborate theatrical ceremonies with masks inside masks. Californians believe a truth comes through the honest sweat of labor. The Californians even had clowns. Woe performed satirical skits about their northern neighbors. They portrayed them as fat, lazy tyrants stumbling around, demanding tribute while real men worked. These were political statements. The Californians knew exactly how Northwest Coast society operated. They rejected it consciously, deliberately, systematically. Consider what this means. The Euro had specific laws making slavery economically impossible. If you killed someone in war, you paid compensation to their family. Their myths told of ancient times when tyrants tried to introduce slavery only to grow fat and lazy and fall to ruin. They prevented slavery through conscious institutional disciplining. But why did the Northwest Coast develop slavery in the first place? The answer reveals something profound about freedom and coercion. Those northern aristocrats need vast quantities of processed food for their competitive feasts. But they couldn't easily force their own free subjects to do this grinding work. Commoners aligned with noble houses. Yes, but they maintained considerable autonomy. They could refuse. They could leave. As one chief admitted, without your people's support, you're nothing. So the nobles looked elsewhere for labor they could fully control. They raided for slaves who had no kinship protection, no ability to refuse. The fee system of slavery emerged not from strength, but from a kind of weakness, the inability to command free people to become drudges. It was precisely because Socomoners retained so much freedom that aristocrats than slaves. These foraging societies of the Pacific Coast shatter our assumptions about social evolution. They show us people well lived before agriculture, making complex political choices about equality and hierarchy, freedom and slavery. Human beings, even 15 centuries ago, even without farming, were capable of fumiging in different ways to organize a society and then choosing between them. This realization fundamentally disrupts the traditional story about agriculture causing inequality. If foragers could create or reject hierarchies through conscious choice, what really happened in the Fertile Crescent, that supersaid birthplace of farming and inequality. The story there turns out to be far stranger than we've been told. Chapter 9. The 3,000-Year Experiment. It's a sunny morning in northern Syria, perhaps 9,000 years ago. A woman walks through tall grasses near the river, gathering wild wheat into her basket. She knows which plants grow thickest, which seeds taste sweetest. Her grandmother taught her these things, just as her grandmother's grandmother hadn't before. She could plant these seeds if she wanted. She knows how. She's done it before in small patches near the settlement. But today she chooses not to dot this choice, repeated countless times across 3 millennia, tells us something remarkable about her ancestors. They deliberately kept their distance from full-scale agriculture, actively resisting what we've been told was inevitable progress. We've been taught that farming appeared like a thunderclap around 10,000 BC. Someone planted seeds. Everyone saw the obvious benefits. And within a few generations, humanity had traded its wandering ways for the plough. This agricultural revolution supposedly trapped us in a cycle of toil and inequality that continues to this day. It's a tidy story. It's also completely wrong. The archaeological record from the Fertile Crescent reveals something far more interesting. Between 10,000 and 7,000 BC, people were experimenting with plants in ways that defy our categories. They tilled soil here and there. They encouraged certain species. Wild grains grew slightly larger near human. Flowers that love disturb a drowned began appearing around their camps. Yet, the genetic changes that marked true domestication didn't become widespread for 3,000 years. Think about that time span. It's longer than the period from ancient Rome to today. People knew exactly what they were doing with. They chose to remain uncommitted to farming for 30 centuries. Scientists have shown through experiments that wheat could develop a non-shattering ratio within decades, maybe a century or two at most. This mutation keeps seeds attached to the stalk, making harvesting easier. It's shown of the key markers of domestication. Our ancestors could have had fully domestic wheat in the time it takes for a few human lifespans to pass. Instead, it took 3 millennia. This was conscious resistance, generation after generation, refusing to cross that line. So what were they doing? They were playing with agriculture rather than embracing it. Small gardens here, scattered seeds there, but always maintaining the freedom to walk away. Full farming meant endless work, preparing fields, pulling weeds, harvesting, threshing, storing grain. It meant staying in one place to guard your crops. It meant inequality as some fields proved better than some families luckier with. Our ancestors looked at this future and said, no, thank you. They preferred what we might call play farming. A little cultivation mixed with hunting, gathering, fishing, travel, time for creating art, telling stories, visiting relatives in distant valleys. They kept their options open. The myth of inevitable agricultural progress crumbles against this evidence of deliberate choice. The technique that made this possible was elegant in its simplicity. In places like the Jordan Valley, seasonal floods would cover the land with rich soil. When waters receded, people scattered seeds on the wet earth. Nature did their heavy lifting. No plowing needed, minimal weeding required. Perhaps they'd build small mud walls to trap water a bit longer. Then they'd move on, returning months later to see what had grown. This system had a beautiful side effect. It prevented the emergence of private property. How could anyone claim permanent ownership of fields they'd vanished underwater each year? Fertile zones shifted with every flood. Your productive patch this season might be a riverbed next year. This uncertainty encouraged communal management of land that belonged to everyone and no one. The system itself resisted the hierarchies that full agriculture would bring. The knowledge driving these experiments most certainly resided with women across the world. Wherever anthropologists have looked, plant expertise belongs primarily to women. Which roots cure stomach pain? Which fibers make strong rope? Which seeds yield the most food? This was the foundation of survival, accumulatrix, generations of careful observation. These early botanical scientists were simultaneously developing basketry, pottery, weaving. Each innovation required patient experimentation, passed generations, the same careful attention that noticed said which plants grew best in disturbed soil. Also figured out how to waterproof a basket with pine pitch. Women knowledge was actively shaping humanity's relationship with plants, keeping it flexible and free. The early Neolithic seems to have been remarkably peaceful. People had time to experiment, to create, to build elaborate social worlds. They were taking their 3,000 years, keeping agriculture at arm's length while they decided whether they really wanted it. Every generation that chose play, farming over full agriculture was making a statement about the kind of life worth living. This long refusal changes everything about how we understand our past. The story of inevitable agricultural progress of humanity trapped by its own cleverness simply falls apart. Our ancestors made choices. They resisted. They found ways to have the benefits of cultivation without the chains of. For 3,000 years, they proved that their way was possible. The agricultural revolution wasn't a revolution at all. It was a slow, contested negotiation that our ancestors fought every step of the way. Chapter 10. Freedom, Farming versus Hierarchy. Çatalhöyük, in central Turkey, around 7,400 BC. Something puzzling is here is a small town where 5,000 people live packed together, in houses that touch each other like cells in a honeycomb. To enter your home, you climb down through a hole in the roof. Inside, something extraordinary catches your eye. Massive bull skulls jut from the walls, their horns spanning through the room. Paintings show men dressed in leopard skins chasing wild boar through forests that no longer exist nearby. Every image celebrates the hunt. And yet when you sit down to dinner with these people, they serve you bread made from wheat they've grown themselves, meat from sheep they've raised since birth. They're farmers who dream of being hunters. This strange contradiction opens a window into something archaeologists have only recently begun to understand. We've been telling ourselves the wrong story about how inequality began. For generations, we assumed that farming created hierarchy, that the moment people planted seeds, they also planted the roots of domination. But the evidence from the ancient Near East demolishes this simplistic The farmers, it turns out, were often the egalitarian ones, organizing their societies around family knowledge and symbols of care. It weighs high hunting neighbors who built the first monuments to male power and This paradox reveals another piece in our story, that the development of human society has always been more about political choices and not economic determinism. When the Ice Age ended around 10,000 BC, the Fertile Crescent became a vast laboratory for human experimentation. The landscape split naturally into down in the river valleys, communities spent thousands of years managing wild cereals along shifting river banks. using the annual floods to tow their proto-crops up in the hills. Other groups built settlements too, but they had different. While the lowlanders were learning to work with plants, the uplanders were hauling massive stones up mountainsides. The lowland communities left behind a particular kind of evidence. Small clay figurines of women, not young and fertile, but mature. Experienced when someone died, their relatives would carefully remove the skull, then spend weeks rebuilding the face with plaster. They'd insert shells for eyes. Paint thefatures keep these reconstructed synths in their homes. This wasn't about taking trophies. It was about refusing to let go. About keeping grandmothers and grandfathers present through acts of patient reconstruction. These were societies that seemed to value care, memory, and the knowledge that comes with age. Particularly familial knowledge about seeds, seasons, and soil travel up into the hills, though, and you'd enter a different world entirely, one that chose a radically different path, despite knowing about farming. At a place called Gubechi, people who hadn't fully committed to farming were carving stone pillars, twice the height of a person. The images on these pillars make your skin crawl. Lions with bad teeth, vultures sending on headless corpses, snakes coiled to strike, and everywhere appearance of erect fallacies, aggressive masculinity literally set in stone. The people who built these monuments collected human skulls, too, but not to lovingly reconstruct faces. These were trophies, some still bearing cut marks from their removal. What's more is that this was a politicois, a deliberate embrace of malpredation and dominance. At another site called Chernu, archaeologists discovered what they termed the House of Skulls. Inside whereth remains of hundreds of people, their heads separated from their bodies and arranged alongside wild animal bones. A stone slab nearby tested positive for human blood. This wasn't ancestor veneration. This was something darker. A culture building its identity around violence and predation. The same community that created these monuments still hunted wild game, still gathered wild plants. They knew about farming from their land neighbors, traded with them regularly, but chose a different path. The paradox couldn't be clearer. The farmers were free. The foragers were building hirchi. What we're seeing here continues. To completely append everything we thought knew about the origins of inequality, too. Neighboring cultures were defining in opposition to each other, making conscious political choices about gender, power, and social organization. The Valley people said, "We know, we honor female knowledge. We're a construct our beloved dead. We share what the floods provide. The hill, we take heads in battle. We raise monuments to male power. We celebrate the hunt and the kill. But what matters is that both groups were making choices about how to organize their societies. And those choices had nothing to do with economic determinism and everything to do with political decisions about gender and power. This evidence flips our entire understanding of early agriculture on its head. The first farmers in the Fertile Crescent didn't create hierarchy. If anything, they resisted it. Their communities remained strikingly egalitarian for thousands of years. At Venice, they grew into proper towns. Meanwhile, it was the peoples who continued hunting and gathering, or at least emphasized these activities, who experimented with domination, who built monuments recurring forced labor, who turned human skulls into trophies of power. The equation we've believed for so long, that farming equals domination, turns out to be exactly backwards. The old story was so simple, so neat, so farming led to property, property to inequality, inequality to civilization as we know it. But the real story refuses to follow such patterns. It reveals instead a complex interplay of ecology, gender, and above all political choice. Human beings, it seems, have always been capable of creating either equality or hierarchy, regardless of how they feed themselves. The question has never been what we eat, but what kind of society we choose to build. The farmers of the Fertile Crescent chose freedom. Their hunting neighbors chose domination. That paradox howled make us question everything we think we know about why we live the way we do. The evidence suggests we've always had more choices than we've been told. So if large farming villages, like Ukatelhoyuk, could remain relatively agationary for centuries, if land farmers could resist hierarchy while upland hunters embraced it, then perhaps our assumptions about cities are wrong too. What happened when human settlements grew even larger? When the first true cities emerged? Did urban scale finally make or did human choice continue eto matter? Chapter 11. Cities without states. Our story inches closer to the present. We find ourselves now on the Ukrainian steppes. Sometime around 4000 BC, feminine sun catches whitewashed walls. Hundreds of houses stretch before you, arranged in perfect circles, one ring inside another, like ripples in still water. This was Teljanki. It covered 800 acres. Perhaps 15,000 people lived here, and here's what archaeologists still find remarkable. There were no palaces, no throne rooms, no evidence of kings whatsoever. The story we've always been told goes something like this. Once you gather thousands of people together, you need some yone in charge. Too many disputes to settle, too much infrastructure to maintain. Cities mean that was supposed to be the iron law of civilization. But Talani suggests otherwise. So does Dravodi, which was even larger and made to. These Ukrainian megasites were humanity's first experiments in urban living. They predate the famous cities of Mesopotamia, and they managed without rulers for 8 centuries. You would have noticed the assembly houses as you walked those circuits. Simple buildings scatter a drag, the settlement. Each districted its own. Not grand temples or administrative centers, just place where neighbors gathered to discuss local concerns. The pottery kilns in Theiston Quarter needed repair. Someone's goats had gotten into the communal gardens. These were the kinds of problems they solved together. The houses tell their own story. Some families had more space, better pottery, finer textiles hanging in their doorways. But the differences were modest, the kind you'd find in any community. Some people were simply better potters. Others had larger families and needed more room. You wouldn't find the mud hovels and marble palaces that would characterize Latin. Everyone lived more or less the same way. How did thousands of people coordinate their lives without permanent leaders? The assembly buildings offer a clue. Decisions were probably made locally, then coordinated between districts when assembled. Perhaps they wrote a responsibilis. You manage grain distribution this season. I'll handle the water channels. The same principle many societies usadai for jury duty or volunteer fire departments. When these cities were finally abandoned around 3300 BC, it wasn't because of conquest or collapse. The people simply moved on. Perhaps the soil was exhausted. Perhaps the climate shifted. Now consider Mesopotamia, where textbooks tell us civilization pre-began. The city of Uruk rose from the Euphrates plain around 3500 BC. Eventually, it would house tens of, but the early centuries left us no monuments to kings, no royal proclamations carved in stone. What we find instead are references to the Sumerian word yukan appears throughout the earliest texts. It describes gatherings where citizens made collective decisions about trade and defense. The city's physical layout reflects communal organizations, large courtyards where hundreds could go, temples that functioned as community centers coordinating harvest, distribution, and flood control. The people who worked in these temples weren't a permanent priesthood. They were citizens fulfilling temporarities, rather like modern jury servicier town council positions. The city essentially ran itself through mass participation, when kings did finally appear in Mesopotamian cities around 2600 BC. They didn't emerge as humanity's natural solution to urban complexity. The historical record suggests they arose from specific circumstances, war leaders who didn't step down after the crisis passed. Temple administrators gradually made their position show. Even then, these early kings had to compete with city assemblies for truth. The assemblies continued meeting, continued making decisions. Royal power was far from absolute. These ancient experiments in urban equality lasted for centuries, sometimes millennia. They proved that thousands of people could coordinate complex irrigation systems, manage food distribution, maintain public buildings, all without permanent rulers. The emergence of kingship wasn't inevitably, it was something else. Perhaps an innovation that began not in the early centers of civilization, but at its unruly edges. Chapter 12. Diverse urban paths and theories of kings. Let's now go on a walk through the streets of Mohenjo-daro. Present-day Pakistan, in 2600 BC, you'd pass house built from bricks, so standardized that a mason from Harappa hundreds of miles away could repair your wall without measuring twice. The drainage system beneath your feet would carry wastewater away through covered channels. Every few blocks you'd find a pot. The whole city laid out in a grid pattern that would make a modern urban planner weep with envy. But here's what you wouldn't find. No palace looming over the neighborhoods, no tomb stuffed with treasures for a dead king. The largest building in town was the Great Bath, a massive public pool waterproofed with bittermensa, rounded by small chambers where people probably performed rituals. After decades of digging, archaeologists keep coming up empty, unusual markers of ancient power. This absence tells us something extraordinary. Cities could thrive without kings. The precious things they do find: carnelian beads, copper tools, the Sephimus carved seals used for trade, turn up all over the residential areas, spread throughout the city like butter on warm bread. It's as if the whole concept of concentrated wealth and power simply hadn't occurred to them. Or Mabethade considered it and decided again. Here was an entirely different experiment in urban living, one that worked for 1,000 years. The citadel areas raised up on massive brick platforms seemed to have been about purity and sacred order. No workshops there, no marketplaces, no hoarded wealth, just ritual space separated from the bustling lower town where actual life happened. Perhaps councils of different craft guilds ran. Perhaps ritual specialists may turn order through ideas about pollution and purity that we can barely glimpse through the archaeological art. The point is, they found their own solution to organizing thousands of people, and it wasn't kingship. What's most remarkable is the absence of feeling. These cities had no defensive walls, despite controlling valuable The art shows no battles or bound captives. The only weapons are simple tools that could have been for hunting or craft work. For 1,000 years, these cities thrived without war, without the whole apparatus of domination that we assume comes with urban life. They were running a completely different experiment from what was happening elsewhere. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, things took a different turn. Around 2900 BC, the first kings emerged. But notice how Latifus was, centuries after cities first appeared. The Sumerian word Lugal, meaning king, literally translates as big man. Essentially, the tough guy who could protect the city or lead raids against enemies. These weren't god kings ruling by divine right. They were war leaders who had to constantly prove themselves. Another experiment, even after kings appeared, those old city assemblies that had governed Uruk and other early cities kept meeting. They limited royal power and manageable lands. The kings had to negotiate, had to persuade, had to work within existing structures. They claimed Neto served the city gods, but never claimed to be gods themselves. It created this awkward fusion, bureaucratic traditions from the untold, complexes mixed with a new kind of politics based on personal loyalty and warrior prowess. Mesopotamia was trying its own unique experiment in scaling up. Sometimes this warrior style crystallized at the edges of civilization. Take Elantopai in the Anatolian highlands. Right when Uruk's influencers spreading northward, the old temple complex there was suddenly demolished. In its place rose a palace decorated with weapons and hunting scenes. Elitatombs appeared containing sacrifice attendants. The focus shifted from keeping careful records to displaying personal glory. Here was yet another way to organize society through competitiveness and personal charisma. These edge societies rejected the hierarchic package. They spurned writing and celebrated individual achievement over institutional competence. The northwest coast potlatch societies, Homeric Greece, the warrior bands of early medieval Europe, they also this competitive person. Leaders gained power through generous feasts and victory in battle. It represented a different answer to the same question. How do we live together in large numbers? Each region mixed these elements differently, proving there was no inevitable formula. Egypt fused divine kingship with sophisticated industries, while suppressing aristocratic competition entirely. The pharaoh's word was law, but that law was administered through careful bureaucracy. Mesopotamia kept the competition between aristocrats, while sovereignty stayed with the gods. The Maya made their kings divine, but also made them compete through ball games and warfare, while projecting bureaucracy into the cosmos itself, imagining gods keeping careful records of human deeds. The Shang rulers of ancient China consulted ancestors. Through oracle, Benesto derived their authority. Maintained a strict competition through brands-making contests, but develop a dimension more gradually. Each combination was an experiment. Each city, each region was testing different ways to organize thousands of people living together. There was no single template being followed. These weren't primitive attempts at statehood, slowly evolving toward our modern systems. They were complete solutions to the problem of urban life, each one revealing that the path we took was just one of many possibilities. Cities could thrive for centrist war rulers. Kings might emerge from the borderlands. Administrative systems could exist without anyone actually in charge. The diversity itself is the revelation. The lesson hidden in these ancient streets and ruins transforms how we understand our own past. There was no single urban revolution marching toward hierarchy and kings. Instead, humanitarian, multiple contested experiments in scaling up social life. And some after-house experiments led to places we can barely imagine from our current vantage point. What we call civilization was never one thing. It was always many things happening all at once. Chapter 13. Diverse Urban Paths and Theories of Kings. When hierarchy finally did emerge in early cities, it took forms so wildly different that archaeologists still puzzle over them. Around 2900 BC in Mesopotamia, the first kings appeared. War leader Shuo wouldn't step down after the crisis burst. The Sumerian word Luga literally means big man. Essentially, the Tao guy who could protect the city. But even these kings had to negotiate it. The old city assemblies that kept meeting kept limiting royal power. They claimed to serve the city gods, but never claimed divinity themselves. Meanwhile, something entirely differently is happening at Al-Anaip in the Anatolian highlands. Right when Urus influence was spreading northward, the old temple complex, there was suddenly demolished. In its place rose a palace decorated with weapons and hunting scenes. Elite tombs appeared containing sacrificed attendants. This wasn't the bureaucracy of temple administrators gradually accumulated. This was raw warrior aristocracy, leaders who gained authority through personal charisma, generous feasts, victory in battle. These edge societies actually rejected the urban package entirely. They spurned writing and celebrated individual glory over institutional competence. H.M. Chadwick called them heroic societies, and you find them everywhere. From Homeric Greece to the northwest coast potlatch cultures, competition bet-win aristocrats with no single sovereign, politics based on spectacular gestures and personal bonds. Often it was these warrior elites from the margins while would eventually impose their rule on urban populations, creating strange hybrid systems. Egypt took yet another path. There, divine kingship fused with sophisticated dynasties, while suppressing aristocratic competition entirely. The pharaoh wasn't just a war leader or first among equals. He was a living god woe's word-shaped reality itself. But the divine authority operated through meticulous bureaucracy. Scribes, recording every bushel of grain, every corps of laborer, every ritual obligation, sovereignty, and administration working in perfect tandem. The Maya would later project bureaucracy onto the cosmos itself. Their kings were divine. Yes, but they also had to compete through ball-game sand warfare. Meanwhile, the imagined dear gods as celestial administratorski, careful records of human deeds in heavenly account books. 3 different principles of power, sovereignty, administration, competition, all operating simultaneously. In Shang China, rulers derived authority from ancestors through oracle bone divination. Every major decision required consulting the dead through cracks in heated turtle shells. Aristocrats competed through bronze-making contests and ritual performance, while administration developed more gradually. Another unique combination. Another experiment in organizing power. Then there's the Indus Valley Mystery. Mohenjo-daro and Harappa had all their hallmarks of sophisticated urban planning, standardized bricks, cove drainage, public baths. But after decades of excavation, no palaces, no royal tombs, no monuments to conquest. The largest structures were all public facilities. Precious materials are without residential areas, rather than concentrated in elite quarters, perhaps organized through craft guilds or ritual purity systems. We can borrow 1,000 years of urban life that somehow sidestepped kingship entry. What made one place develop god kings while another embraced warrior aristocracy? Why did some cities maintain collective orans for centuries while others quickly developed. Ruling elites. Thena's were seems to lie in specific historical circumstances, rather than universal laws. A war that didn't end when it should have. A temple administrator who made his position hereditary. A charismatic warrior who redistributed enough wealth to gain permanent followers. Sometimes, different systems collided when warrior aristocracies from the margins conquered urban centers. They had to graft their personalistic tactics onto existing bureaucracies. When expanding Empire Sab's foreign cities, they imposed their own models of sovereignty. Each collision created new hybrids, new experiments. The diversity matters because it shatters our assumptions about political evolution. These weren't embryonic states, slowly developing toward their final form. They were complete evolutions, each combining different principles of power in distinct ways. Some emphasized the sovereign Sabri command. Others focused on administrative control. Still, others revolved around charismatic competition. The modern state's peculiar achievement was to eventually combine all three: sovereignty, bureaucracy, and competitive politics into a single system. But that was just one more experiment, not the inevitable destiny toward which all others were heading. Looking at these early cities with their radically different approaches to hierarchy and power, we see that the arc of history could have bent in any direction. The story gets even stranger in Mesoamerica, where cities would build massive pyramids and practice human sacrifice, then suddenly abandon Edmonchi altogether, embarking on unprecedented political experiments. Butho did this happen. Chapter 14. American experiments. Around the year 300 AD, something trendy happened at Tiote in central Mexico. The city had been following a familiar path. Massive pyramids, human sacrifice, all the trappings of emerging kingship. The temple of the feathered serpent had been consecrated with hundreds of sacrificial victims. Warriors buried with necklace of human teeth, infants placed at the pyramid's corners. The pyramids of Thesan and Moon dominated the skyline, proclaiming the power of whoever commanded their construction. Then the people of Teotihuacan changed their minds. This is something we haven't seen before in our journey through history. Cities without kings, yes. Cities that resist becoming kingdoms, certainly. But here was a city that had already started down. The path of hierarchy already built its pyramid sand, performed its sacrifices, and then decided to turn back. They attacked the temple of the feathered serpent with deliberate fury. They smashed its celebrate facade, scattered its offerings, and buried the entire restructure under tons of new construction. The pyramid building stopped. The large-scale sacrifices ended. And then, in a move that still puzzles ecologists, they embarked on one of history's most ambitious social housing projects. Instead of palaces for rulers, the city started building apartments. Over the following centuries, Teotihuacan constructed housing for perhaps 100,000 residents. Every single person in the city. These compounds were built from stone with plastered walls and drainage systems. Private courtyards spanned onto rooms where extended families lived together. 60 to 100 people sharing communal spaces. Walking through Teotihuacan in each day would have been remarkable. Every family, regardless of status, lived in similar conditions. Eating tortillas with turkey and rabbit, drinking pool, accessing imported goods from across Mesoamerica. The murals that decorated these compounds showed vibrant communal scenes, sometimes apparently psychedelic visions, but never clear depictions of rulers or hierarchies. Art historian Esther Pastor observed the city consciously rejected the personality cults of contemporary cities developing an artistic style that emphasized collective values, depicting figures as identical in size and importance. Think about what this means. A society had tasted kingship and rejected it. They knew what hierarchy looked like, had built monuments to it. Anthon consciously dismantled those monuments and built something else entirely. How does a city of 100,000 people function after such a revolution? Archaeologists have found what might be the answer. 20 neighborhood Templars scattered across the urban landscape, each one serving about 100 apartment blocks. These probably housed local councils that managed district affairs. When citywide decisions needed making, representatives would have coordinate between neighborhoods. The sophisticated governance that emerged lasted centuries. Life in Teotihuacan wasn't without its tensions. In the Teopanasco district, TF Coast immigrants maintained their own traditions behind compound walls, including violent rituals involving. These tensions might have contributed to the city's eventual abandonment around 550. Yet for centuries, Teotihuacan had demonstrated something extraordinary. A major urban center could taste power, rejected and thrive. Fast forward nearly 1,000 years when Hernan Cortes marched into Mexico, he encountered another urban experiment at the conquistador, trained to identify and negotiate with kings, found himself confused. Tlaxcala had no supreme overlord. He compared its government to Venice or Genoa, republican cities familiar to Europeans. The Spanish needed allies against the Aztec Empire, and Tlaxcala's decision would prove pivotal. The debate in Tlaxcala's council chamber went on 4 days. We know what was said. Becca's participants and their descendants later recounted fragments to Spanish chroniclers. Fielder statesman Jacatin Cartel stood before the assembly and warned against these strangers. He argued, were like ravenous monsters, gorging themselves on gold and silver. They would make cruel masters. Then he asked Ked's question that cut to the heart of everything. Why would we, who live without servitude and never acknowledge kings, spill our blood only to make ourselves into slaves? That phrase, never acknowledged a king, tells us something crucial. The Tlaxcalans knew what kingship was. They were surrounded by kingdoms and empires. They had chosen a different path and defended it for generations. The council wrestled with psychotic Cartel's question. Members proposed compromises, tested them, reconsidered. The councillors, called tuti, were elected officials answerable to their communities. Becoming a councillor required passing trials, designed to test humility. Candidates endured public humiliation and fasting and moral instruction. The system selected, for self-deprecation, those who would put community before personal glory. The city's physical layout reflected its politics. No central palace dominated skyline. Well-built residential in district plazas. A separate civic complex outside the settlement hosted assemblies. Archaeological evidence confirms, with Spanish observed. Here was a functioning republic of perhaps 150,000 people, with markets that drew 30,000 traders, all governed through consensus on debate. These American experiments show you something we haven't encountered before in our story. Teotihuacan's housing revolution came after pyramid building and human sacrifice had already begun. Tlaxcala's republic persisted while surrounded by empires that must have seemed more powerful and glorious. These were societies that looked hierarchy in the face and chose to walk away. If cities this large could reverse course, if equality could be built on the ruins of attempted kingship, then perhaps the paths of history are more flexible than imagine. The Americas had prevented something profound. cities could change their minds. Chapter 15. What is a state, anyway? In 1521, Hernán Cortés stood in the central plaza of Tlaxcala, struggling to write a letter to his king. The city governed itself without a monarch. It made collective decisions, waged wars, conducted diplomacy. Cortés reached for comparisons. Venice, perhaps, or Genoa. Nothing quite fit. The word didn't really exist yet. State wouldn't become common for a third generation when European scholars started grappling with new forms of emerging around them. We throw the word around casually today, as if everyone knows what a state is. Max Weber tried to pin it down in the early 1900s. A state, he said, was whatever entity claimed a monopoly on legitimate violence within a territory. Apply that to Hammurabi's Babylon, though, and you'll see the problem immediately. The Great Logava controlled maybe the area around his polis. Local strongmen ran their villages however they pleased. Temple authorities enforced their own justice. Family patriarchs ruled their households with absolute authority. If Babylon was a state, it was a peculiar one. But what if we've been missing something all along? The thing is, when we talk about the origin of the state, we're jamming together three completely different things that spent most of history in separate streams. There's sovereignty, raw command, the ability to punish and reward. There's bureaucracy, information control, record keeping, the management of knowledge. And there's competitive politics, charisma, popularity, the ability to win followers through personal magnetism. We assume these naturally go together because in our world they do. Governments today claim sovereignty, run bureaucracies, and hold elections. We've forgotten that for most of human history, these were separate phenomena that rarely combined. Theme of ancient Mexico built their entire society around competitive odds alone. Those colossal stoneheads, each one portraying a differential with distinct features, celebrate and bill achievement. Ball court hosted games where players won glory and sometimes lost their heads. Public rituals became stages for elites to display their power and attract followers. Search their ruins all Yawant. You won't find administrative virtues or legal codes. Power moved through personal contests and achievements, never solidifying into institutions. Travel to Shaven Diantor in Peru around 800 BC and you'll find something completely different. Priests led pilgrims through underground labyrinth, while hidden water channels created through of jaguars in the darkness. Stone carvings depicted transformations so intricate they could only be understood after taking hallucinogenic snuff. The temple complex hoarded cosmic knowledge. They had no ball courts, no thrones, no competitive displays. Authority came purely from controlling information, from being the sole interpreters after the mysteries. The Natchez of the lower Mississippi chose pure sovereignty. Their ruler, the sun, embodied absolute power within his immediate presence. His word meant instant death or elevation. When th died, wives and retainers were strangled to follow him into thief.